A little while back, I really fancied doing smart journaling in a circular journal. Don't know why, just fancied it. Different shape, different approach. And I could not find one for love nor money online, and I'm pretty good with Google. So if you know where I can get one, please tell me. Anyway, I thought, well, I can make one myself, and this is my little prototype. Cover, no spine, just tape the spine, and I used a glue binding. I didn't bother with sewing because, well, frankly, I'm too lazy. And I've loved it. As you can see, I've used it in different ways. This prototype was not perfect. I've had to actually stick some of the pages back in, and the paper I used, because it was a prototype, really horrible watercolour paper. But there you go, that's life. As a starter, I think that's pretty good. Lots of people have said, oh, show us how you did it. So at last, I've got round to making these films. I've done two parts because the first film, and if you've missed it, please go back and have a look, is just how to adapt an ordinary book that you've already got, this was just a sketchbook, into a circular, in this case, oval sketchbook. In the second part, I'm going to show you how to start from scratch so you could be in control. Before we go through the materials we need, just want to say hello. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire. Every week I share a tip, trick or technique I wish I'd known about ages ago. This video is sponsored by Craftsy, and I don't usually do sponsored videos, but it seemed a perfect partnership because Craftsy is a place where you can find all sorts of courses or workshops when you're feeling creative. And this book that we're going to make is perfect for when you're feeling creative because you can use it for sketching, urban sketching, you can use it for watercolouring, or you can use it for art journaling and mixed media. I'll tell you more about Craftsy later on, and they have got a cracking good deal if you fancy joining them. Right, what do we need? I've tried to keep this as simple as possible so that there's no specialist equipment. When you're making your own books, you can sew your pages together, but then you'd need an awl to make the holes and a special needle and linen thread and beeswax and all sorts, which is beautiful, but not what we're trying to do here. First of all, you'll need some paper, and I'm suggesting putting watercolour paper in this because it's really substantial, will hold up to a lot of abuse if you're going to journal in this. Or I could use it as a sketchbook, go out and about. Got this paper, which is from Hannah Muller. It's hot pressed, and the reason I'm putting it in this book is I don't ever paint on hot press. It's just not a surface I enjoy. 300 grams, which is 140 pounds, so it's good and substantial, and I reckon this will be great. You will need a cutting mat, a sharp knife, because paper really blunts your knives quickly, probably a pencil, maybe a little bit of sandpaper. We'll need some sort of glue, just white PVA glue, school glue is perfect. We'll need something for the cover. This is called grey board. You can use the back of an old sketchbook. You could use a hardback book that you don't need anymore, something like that. I do like to put a closure on my books because often they get very thick when I've stuck loads in, so I've got a bit of ribbon. If and only if you have a bone folder, and this is plastic, not bone, it is a bookmaking thing, you use it for squashing down folds to make them really sharp. If you've got one, that's super. If not, the end of a pair of scissors is just as good as smoothing the paper down. So again, you don't need something specialist. You might need a pair of scissors just to trim things off. Entirely up to you. If you want to decorate your cover, you might want some papers, and I found this. I thought, oh, that's yummy. Some papers to decorate your covers. You could paint them, you could leave them undecorated, print them, collage them, up to you. Right, those are the materials we need, but before we get going, I wanted to share a bit more about Craftsy. It's a place to find all sorts of classes and projects, but it's more than that. Once you've joined it, it's an online community of like-minded people.
They cover painting and drawing, and you'll find mixed media, watercolour, urban sketching, all sorts of things. But they also cover things like cooking, baking, sewing, knitting, crocheting, lots of crafts. I'm certainly hoping to up my cake decorating skills. They've come up with a brilliant offer for new members only. So if you want to try it out, the first 1,000 people to join using the link in the description gets a whole year of membership and access to as many classes as you like, all for $1.49 instead of $123. So in pounds, that's just over £1 or €1.40. The great thing is they're always adding new classes, which helps keep you inspired. And their videos are taught by experts, so they've got something from beginners through to those who are pretty expert themselves. And they even do live streams too. Right, let's get on with this book.
First thing is to decide on the size of your book, and that will be partly dictated to by the size of the paper you've got. And mine is 50 by 65 centimetres. I hate wasting, so let's think what size pieces of paper will waste the least. If I did my book 25 centimetres, so that's half of that, I would get 4 pages out of that because I'd have to do circles, and that would be 50, and I'd have a strip of 15 centimetres left over, and I would get 4 per page. If on the other hand I did it roughly like that, so 65, and I did everything 21, that would be 42, so I would have a strip of 8 centimetres left over there, and I would be able to get 6 21 circles out of my paper. The size is entirely your choice. How big do you want it to be? Let's just look at the 2 I made. So my prototype was 20, just over 23, almost 24 centimetres. The cover is going to be slightly bigger, and this one, I think from memory, was 21. Yes, this is 21, but is not fully circular. You could do a huge one, you could do a really small one. Actually, for me, cutting the circles of paper, the contents, is the hardest part. It's quite hard to be super accurate. So you can now buy circular watercolour paper. It will be more expensive than using sheets and cutting itself, but it'll be a lot quicker. And I've also seen that you can get cardy paper with gorgeous deckled edge circular. So, you know, have a look around. You might be able to find a good deal on those, and you might want to use that as your contents. Just a thought. But I'm going to cut out of these pieces of paper because I've got them already, and I'm going to do them circles of 21 centimetres. I think that the easiest thing to do is to cut squares first, then cut your circles. And you might think, oh, why do it twice? And what I hadn't thought about when I did my prototype was, once it's circular, you don't know which way up the paper is, and paper has a grain to it. So it's worth understanding that paper has a grain to it. If you tear your paper one way, it tears really straight, whereas if you tear it the other way, not so straight. So the grain of this paper, the fibres of the paper are lined in this way. Here they're more random as they go across, and therefore it's harder to tear straight. If you're a proper bookbinder, and frankly I'm not, I'm a bit of a shoddy bookbinder, but I love making books, you would want to ascertain the grain of your paper and make sure it's all aligned, because when you fold paper, it's far easier to fold with the grain and you get a far crisper fold, whereas if you go across the grain, it kind of crinkles more. If you've cut your circles and you've got a nice stack of circles, you don't know which way the grain's going, and at least I would try and get the grain going in the same direction. So if we cut squares first, fold them in the way we want, then cut the circles out of them, we can be sure our grain's consistent. Okay, I've got my squares, and now I'm going to cut those into circles. And now I'm just going to fold it in half. Either use that bone folder we talked about to smooth out the fold, and I'd turn it the other way and do both sides because it is a very thick paper, or I'd use the handles of the scissors. I found a plate, Cookies for Santa, that is the perfect size. I find it easier to cut round something rather than to draw. You can get circular cutters. They're quite expensive to get a decent quality one that gives you a good cut, but if you've got one, lucky you, do use it. I'm just going to cut round on my cutting mat with my sharp knife, making sure the plate doesn't move. If you've got one of these knives that have little bits that break off, I reckon it's worth just taking off the end portion. And I'm sure you already knew, but if you take the end bit off, it usually has a little notch that you can put your segment in, and then there you go, just break off the end of the knife. That gives you a lovely sharp blade. It is a false economy, I promise you, to keep going with a blunt knife, because it'll scuff the edge and you won't get a decent cut. And that is one of my pages, and I have my stack that I've already done, so I need to fold them all and put them in a stack like this. Don't worry if there are some little bits left over. I'll show you a way that we can sort that out once we've got this stuck and formed our book block. So you've got your stack. We need to get all the papers as evenly as possible. So this is totally flat and that they're in the right place there. And then we can use a bulldog clip like that to keep it in place. We're going to be gluing here, so make sure that end is free. If you have got a little book press or a flower press or a tie press, anything like that, you could use that, because that will apply even pressure all the way along. But again, as you know, I'm a big believer in using what you've got. So if you've only got a couple of bulldog clips like that, you'll be fine. And we are going to apply glue all along the spine. This is called a perfect binding, and it's basically how paperback books are bound. Traditionally, books were sewn with special stitching, and you could still do that. So if you know how to book bind, or you want to learn and you've got the equipment, brilliant, just use that binding, it will be stronger. But I've used this glued binding on quite a few, I've come out of line there, quite a few of my books, and it stood up to abuse really rather well. Do check everything's in line, and then we can apply a layer of glue all the way along and make sure it just goes in. We don't just want so much that it dribbles in and sticks the pages together, but basically it will bind those together. While that's drying, I'm going to stick another clip there to keep that in place. So we'll let that dry. Then we'll put another layer on, and we'll probably do about 4 or 5 layers. While the first layer of our glue is drying, let's get on with the covers. I've got the back of an old sketch pad here. I found another plate that is slightly bigger than the plate that I used for cutting the inside pages. You want that because then if the cover's bigger, it protects all the edges of your papers. You can buy grey board in craft shops, or online. Say usually I reckon you'll probably have the back of an old sketchbook or something you'll be able to use. It's a lot thicker than paper, so you need to do the cuts just gradually. Again, using the sharpest knife you've got, and just repeat round. Don't try and get through in one cut, because you won't, and you'll get a far smoother line if you do it sort of in 3 or 4 passes. Okay, there's my circle. I need to cut it in half. Did I do that right? Yes, good. That's a relief. My big question in my head is, do I want to put a spine on this? In my prototype I didn't, but to do something new I think I would like to put a spine on. Do not have to cover the spine at all, that is really your choice. I just thought I would have a go at it to do something a bit different from my prototype. Let's double check again what that width is. Just over 23, wasn't it? So I am going to cut it there. Those are basically my cover pieces. What you have to do is place your pieces, so your circle, and the strip that's the same width as your book block. You need to leave a little gap between these so they can bend, and we've got to cover this. So you need about a centimetre and a half, so that's about ½ inch all the way round, so we can fold that over. I'm going to mark things in place by drawing round my covers. I am eyeballing the centre. You could measure it terribly accurately should you wish to. Just before we cover it, if by any chance you've got rough edges on your cover, you can just use a little bit of sandpaper and smooth those off, because we do want it to be good and circular. Now I'm going to be quite generous with my glue in the places where it's going to be stuck down. Doesn't matter if I put in a bit extra, because it's going to dry before it gets anywhere near my proper sort of book block. So let's just get this glue on. So I'm putting my spine in place. Some people use spacers just to make sure that they get everything really straight. Wow, I say I'm doing everything by eye. If we're using thinner paper that's more prone to wrinkling, do check that you haven't got any air bubbles, but this is scrapbooking paper, so it's pretty good actually. Now what I like to do is score round to help folding. So I'm using that bone folder in the pointy end and just scoring the paper. But if you've got scissors, you don't want to cut it, so close them and you could score round like that, and it just makes the folding process that little bit easier. We now need to trim the paper all the way round, and I would leave about 1.5 centimetres. This raw edge will be covered. Now we need to notch in all the way round. Again, about every centimetre, 1.5 centimetres, every ½ inch, whatever units you're working in. Just make a little snip. Just protect our work surface. And then we're going to apply glue all around that edge. We could apply glue if we want to onto the board, but I like to apply glue onto the paper because it starts to soak in and it sort of softens the paper up and makes it a little bit more pliable, which means that you can get a tighter curve and a smoother curve. Having done that, we now need to fold the paper up, and each little notch will slightly overlap the previous one. So just smooth it into place and get it as tight against the cover as possible, and just do that nice and patiently. I'm wearing such a silly thing to be gluing. I've got really floppy cuffs on my cardigan which are going to get covered. I don't want to get glue onto the cover, so I am going to have to be a little bit careful. Halfway, just keep going. You can feel, say, the paper is just a little bit more flexible because it's damp from the glue. That just means you can get a really nice tight finish. And there you have your cover. Oh, that's really pretty. We need to weight it down to dry. And because I've got glue here, if I just stuck it, I don't know, under a book, there's a danger I'm going to stick it to the book. So this stuff, which is just the middle of a cereal packet that I have made sure is clean, is great non-stick paper. Put that over there. Or in fact, look, I could sandwich that in between. Put a heavy weight on and that will dry lovely and flat. While your covers are drying, you could apply another layer of glue to your spine. Make sure your clips aren't in the way if you're using clips. I would then let this dry overnight, let those covers dry lovely and flat overnight, and we can assemble it tomorrow. It's the next morning and everything is dry and everything appears to have stuck together, which is always a relief. So there's my book block, there's my cover, and there's my enclosure. Just before we stick it all together, it is worth a final check whether there's anything you can need to smooth off on the pages or just sort out. What you can do is grab a bit of sandpaper again and hold your book together and just smooth bits off. Sadly, it's never going to be absolutely smooth. It's a handmade book. It just isn't. If you've used pre-cut circular paper, potentially yours will, but I reckon even then you're going to have a little bit of movement. If you're using a ribbon to enclose it, simply find the centre of the ribbon. I just want to sort of stick it in place. Is there a right or a wrong side of the ribbon? I don't think there is. So halfway, and it'll just hold it in place while I assemble everything. And what we have to do is basically stick this cover or this front page to this cover, and we will enclose that ribbon. Stick this to this cover, enclosing that ribbon. We do not stick the spine. We've got to position the book so that it covers the raw edges, and this page basically acts as our end covers. I don't want to get glue on the bit that's going to show, so I am going to glue the page rather than the cover. Put a bit of paper in there just to protect the rest of the book. You don't want to get glue on the spine, so go a bit careful around there. Line that up super carefully. Make sure that ribbon isn't caught. I've got a few moments before it starts to dry, so don't worry. And that's one cover popped on. Let's do exactly the same with the back one. If you had simply painted your covers rather than covering them in paper, you do exactly the same. And let's fold that over. Oops. This might be slightly trickier. It'll only take a little time to dry, so I'll come back in an hour.
Everything's dry, and here is the finished book, which I think looks really rather smart. It's got that tie closure, and we've got our circular pages, which will hopefully really spark off lots of imaginative sketching or doodling or journaling, whatever you decide to use it for. Just comparing it with the one that we made from an existing book, I have to say I do think the binding on this will be a lot stronger, just because it's a sewn binding. I do rather like that sort of woven in and out tie. What I always like to think at the end of a project, how will I do it better? And I really need to think of a better way of cutting these holes because they weren't terribly neat. But, you know, there you go. In terms of this one compared to the prototype, it looks a lot smarter because I put the spine, the covered spine on. But I'm not sure that that is the most practical thing in the world, and maybe just taping the spine like I did on this one, this is just cloth tape, is fine. I'm not sure that spine is actually worth the extra effort, whereas if you do two separate covers and then just tape the spine, you can use far smaller pieces of paper to cover. So if you've got smaller pieces, actually those separate ones would be better. So that's the sort of thing I always try and think about in my sort of final analysis. But I hope you've enjoyed that and that you can be inspired with a lovely circular book, that it will inspire you to greater and better things.